The Rebel Capitalist Show.
All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone back to the Rebel Capitalist Show. He is my good buddy, and he is kind of like the official Rebel Capitalist lawyer. His name is Robert Barnes. Robert, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so for those of my viewers and listeners who have been kind of living under a rock or not paying attention, Robert and myself have kind of gone after the Fed from a legal standpoint through the FOIA, which is the Freedom of Information Act. So we haven't got to the point of suing them yet, but we're requesting documents through the FOIA. And if they don't give us the documents we're requesting, then we kind of take it to the next step. We've been in this, going back and forth on this. We've initiated the process. What was it, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, something like that. So I want to do periodic updates for the listeners and the viewers and some who contributed to our GoFundMe campaign as to what the progress is. So Robert, I'll hand the baton over to you, my friend. How are we doing with the FOIA?
So we're in the information request, production request stage, and we should be getting answers from the Fed by around mid-September. They may try to buy some more time. The latest would be late October before, if they don't produce by that point, then we will file suit. And so it'll be an interesting summer because going after the Fed and the FDA in the same summer will be an interesting summer.
Oh, is that what you're doing? The FDA as well?
Yeah, going to be working with Bobby Kennedy and Children's Health Defense and going to be suing the FDA to block certain aspects of the Pfizer and other vaccines as to whether they meet certain legal standards based on it's kind of like what we're doing with the Fed. Yeah. Bobby Kennedy did a citizen petition process, and the FDA just never answered. And so it's going to require suit to get into certain safety issues, efficacy issues, particularly for children in the case of his citizen petition.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. I'll definitely have to keep track. And I want to go down that path further. But before we do, what are, let's see, as far as the funds, because I know a lot of my viewers participated in that GoFundMe campaign. And I want to thank them for that. I matched it dollar for dollar. But we hit our goal within, I don't know, was it like 36 hours or something like that? So the bulk of the money that we've spent so far, where has that gone?
So all that money has gone to the associates and the accountants who helped come up with the FOIA request and that process. Right. It'll also cover some of the copy cost. What happens with a FOIA request is if they do produce documents, they say they want certain amounts of money for cost, like the copying cost, all that.
Oh,
it's a little bit.
Fed does that, or the entity does that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's one of their scams. Like if they want to try to deter people, they'll produce a bunch of documents, even if like a lot of them don't really relate. And a lot of our requests are broad, so theoretically they could say, well, we'll do a document dump on them and make them pay 10 cents a copy, even though it's mostly sent electronically often these days.
Right.
But they try to use that it's mostly a deterrent, but there's still sufficient funds to cover any of those costs in case they try to do that cost shifting.
Oh, I didn't know that. But
so, we're requesting stuff going back to 1913, all the memorandums, various internal memorandums like when they've said interesting things at the open meeting hearings over the years, like, golly gee, if we do that, we'll have to have well, they said, well, our books will have to match the government's books. But interesting statements, any problematic statement that suggests there's a memorandum behind it, a memorandum attached to it. In some of these cases, they actually overtly reference the memorandums. They say, according to the team memorandums, if we do this, we have to finally comply with this law. Is that really true? And you only get these open meeting full transcripts, of course, years after the fact, because that's how the Fed operates. But we went through all of those to get specific request items. What memorandum is this person referencing, so forth. But we're asking for stuff all the way back to 1913. So theoretically, there could be 100,000 documents. Now, I don't anticipate them giving us that amount of documents, but it's one guy's. But there's sufficient funds to pay the copy cost too. So at this point, we haven't exhausted the funds at all.
Yeah, and then we put up, I think, 62.5 with what I put in, but then I am giving the additional funds, what is it, 37.5, something like that, to take us up to 100,000 total.
Yep.
But as far as the accountant, you mentioned them. We have to hire a special accountant. We can't just hire anyone at H&R Block. So I would assume, what is their specialty, and why do we have to have someone specific?
So we went out and got an accountant that is a longtime bank auditor. So the goal was more than a decade of experience as a bank vice president, small local bank, so not connected to any Federal Reserve banks, no conflicts. And now, in fact, is on his own as an independent forensic accountant, but has a long history in auditing other banks. That's what he used to do for accounting firms before he went in-house at a bank. So the goal was to have someone who had technical knowledge of how they internally do these things to confirm, because basically what we're doing is we're auditing the Fed by FOIAing the Fed. And we may probably have to sue the Fed to ultimately achieve that, but that's the goal, to use the Freedom of Information Act to get the information a bank auditor would demand to see what the actual records reflect. Now, we're doing even more than that. We're asking for all the legal memorandums, all their internal documents, their internal admissions of the limitations of their own authority. Well, we're requesting everything that relates to anything they've ever said about certain tax powers. And we may do another FOIA if this infrastructure bill passes that includes this crypto component.
Right.
We may ask them we've asked them a bunch of questions about what their digital currency records and files are, but we may expand that list as well. But the goal is to have somebody who understood the technical terminology of what you would look for within the banking industry, so we would be specific enough that they would be obligated to produce the documents or give us the legal basis to sue.
Right. Okay. So I know you texted me the other day about the cryptocurrency tax potentially in this new infrastructure bill. Can you walk through that a little bit? I didn't realize that.
It's extraordinary. It's a bifurcated aspect. One aspect of is a tax. The tax itself doesn't even raise a whole lot of money. But what they're really trying to do is set the legal precedent of treating any amount you ever dealt in crypto as if all of its income and none of its property. Because constitutionally, the federal government can't tax property. They can only tax what's called income, which the U.S. Supreme Court has limited that interpretation and said the word income under the 16th Amendment only means the gain separated from the source. In other words, gain from property, it can't be property itself. And so
how can they do property taxes?
The feds can't. The feds disguise, like even when they do like inheritance tax, sure seems like a property tax.
I see that the states can, but the feds can't.
Exactly. States can.
Okay.
Local governments can, but the feds cannot because of the apportionment clause and the uniformity clause. And because at the time of the Constitution, they didn't want any head taxes. That was their big fear. And different people had different reasons for that, different political groups within the country. But it's always been recognized that couldn't be done. Originally, when the income tax went through, the Supreme Court called it unconstitutional back in the 1890s because they said, really, this is just a disguised property tax. The 16th Amendment passes, the Supreme Court comes in and says all they did is here's what happened. The judge who dissented in the decision in the 1890s and said an income tax is not a property tax, flash forward after the 16th Amendment is passed, he's now chief judge. And he says, you know what? All the 16th Amendment did was say I was right back in the 1890s. This is the way judges rule. So, but by doing so, he basically limited the definition of income under the 16th Amendment to say it only means what I said it meant back in the 1890s. And that's why ever since then, Congress has played games with trying not to define income and playing all the kind of games that led to, Irwin Schiff's issues with the way things are done, all of that. But they're always looking for ways to sneak in a new tax. They would love to tax property. And they're trying to, the reason why the crypto tax is not that impactful in terms of money raised, it raises a tiny percentage, I think it's 28 million they're anticipating. Their real goal is to have it be so low that people don't really fight it, so that they can set the precedent that they can tax crypto up to 100% of crypto holdings. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to treat every penny in crypto as if it's income, regardless of what your basis ever was in it. They're trying to so that's part one of it. The other part was almost a crypto killing component of infrastructure bill which was basically going to impose such a harsh, it said all brokers now had to be spies on the people that they do business with in the crypto industry.
Right.
But they defined brokers so broad, it pretty much defined anybody, including like minors. I mean, you were going to put people in a position who didn't even have access to the information, weren't really part of crypto transactions except indirectly, and you were going to make them all criminals unless they gathered the information. And if they couldn't gather the information, they would be committing a crime.
It's the know your customer laws. The KYC laws that the banks have to abide by?
Exactly.
Basically, if your customer does something wrong, you're legally liable.
Correct. And they were imposing these KYC laws on everybody that had any tangential connection to crypto. So, they were selling it as, oh, this is just for Coinbase, et cetera. But you dug into the law and it applied to minors. It applied to software developers. It applied to blockchain developers. I mean, it was so broad. And so crypto, a lot of people connected to crypto went nuts and temporarily derailed it, but only temporarily, because they're still, because what they want to do is they want to have the power to crush crypto overnight. So they want to have the power to tax it into oblivion and the power to regulate it and criminalize different aspects of it so that nobody could do it without risk of going to prison. And they're disguising it under infrastructure. So that it's a real risk to crypto. There's a lot of people in crypto are awake to it, but not everybody, because nobody's paying attention because it's in the infrastructure bill.
Right. Yeah. It's like so many of those laws that get passed, they just put you got to read the fine print. You sign off on it thinking that it's meant for one thing. And then, 10, 15 years later, you realize that it was meant for something completely different.
Another example of that in the infrastructure bill is they're trying to require cars not only have means of testing you so that you couldn't drive if you were drunk or intoxicated theoretically, but also they're trying to require all cars to have internal surveillance abilities in them, so that any law enforcement official could tap into your car and look at what you're doing in your car at any given time, under the guise that this is being done to avoid drunk driving. So it's also in the infrastructure bill. It's like, what does this have to do with infrastructure? But this is classic.
That's in the infrastructure. And what infrastructure bill are you referring to specifically?
The current one that's about to pass the Senate.
Jeez. So there's language in the law that talks about how the authorities can have access to your car, or how cars need to be equipped. Yes. To give authorities access to basically use surveillance techniques to determine where you're driving, how you're driving, what you're doing in your car, etc.
Exactly. It's when you see what they're doing to crypto, when you see what they're doing to just being able to drive your car, and disguising that in the context of infrastructure, and then you put it in the broader context of what's happening in the vaccine mandate space. Right. And where that's going, you can see this is all about control. This has very little to do with real worries about a particular virus. This is about using the virus as a pretext of massive power.
Yeah, so that's where I wanted to go with this conversation after we did the review of what we're doing at the Fed, because like we were saying offline, I've come to the realization in my own life that regardless of the size of your portfolio, if you don't have personal freedom and liberty, you've got nothing. And on this channel with my whiteboard videos and everything, I try to help people understand the economic world around them so they can make better financial decisions. But at the end of the day, the only reason that we want to increase or better our financial position is so we have more freedom. And if those freedoms are being taken away from us right in front of our own eyes, what difference does it make? If your portfolio is $10 million or 100,000? If you can't leave your house, or you can't, drive your car, you can't open your business, you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a movie theater, you can't get on an airplane. So let's kind of go into a deep dive about the legality and what's going on with these vaccine mandates, which, quite frankly, are to me personally, they're alarming, to say the least. I just don't see how Americans and citizens of other countries are just allowing this to happen and not doing anything about it. So can you walk us through what happened for those of my viewers who don't know with what happened in New York City? And then if you could expand on that by comparing what is happening now in New York City with what happened back in 1900, or I believe it was the late 1800s, when they had a vaccine mandate for smallpox. I think that would be really interesting, because that's a lot of the pushback that you get on social media, is that, well, this is no big deal because we've had these vaccine mandates in the past. We had them for smallpox. We have them for kids when they go to school. So what's the big deal? Why not have a COVID mandate as well?
Well, very much. I mean, the way I put it to people is, if the government owns your body and the government can dictate your medical choices, what do you own? Because, I mean, what does it mean to own anything if you don't own your own body? You don't have freedom over your own medicine. And so fundamentally, constitutionally, and historically, that was always established, whether you're talking about John Locke, whether you're talking about Blackstone, whether you're talking about any of the founders. Benjamin Rush. I mean, Benjamin Rush was against any form of medical licensure monopoly by the state because he said it would inevitably be misused and abused. He said medical tyranny would be the worst form of tyranny we've ever seen. He was one of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, one of the great medical doctors during the Revolutionary era. So all of them were very cognizant of no emergency exception to the Constitution. During the Constitution time period in which the Bill of Rights was passed and the first Constitution was done, and the whole Revolution era, there were multiple smallpox epidemics. And even though smallpox is something that could be eradicated by vaccines, that could have justified emergency use theoretically, all of our founders said, no, we're not going to have any emergency exception into our Constitution, period. So they were more cognizant of health risks than any kind of health risk we face today. Smallpox killed 1 out of 3 people it infected. And so that's the sort of broader history. And it was generally considered to be a battery, an invasion of your body, if it was not done with informed consent, a common law tort protected under the 9th Amendment throughout almost all of our history until we got to the eugenics era. And the disturbing thing was the number one champions of eugenics around the world were not the Nazis. It was the United States of America. And in particular, it was the federal judges in the United States of America. Now, they're the same kind of people you'll find justifying, rationalizing, supporting, and putting in things like the Federal Reserve. It's a lot of the same actors because they wanted governmental control and governmental monopolies over certain things to protect their economic interests. Rockefeller Foundation, huge champion of eugenics. The Harriman legacy, huge champion of eugenics.
So who was the president at that time? Because I remember reading that he was a proponent of eugenics as well.
Yeah, well, by 1905, that was Teddy Roosevelt. And so you've had different people pretty much from 1905 to 1945 is what I call the eugenics era in American courts. And I call it the 3 big decisions were the trilogy of infamy, as I call them. And the foundational decision was Jacobson. And that's the case from 1905 they cite as the grounds to require vaccines. And then they just got worse. Jacobson was the only decision cited in I think it was 1925, Buck v. Bell, where they said they could do forced sterilizations. And to give you an idea, the Indiana University, in justifying their vaccine mandate, said Buck v. Bell was still good law. So they're saying
just recently,
just in the last month, you have the state of Indiana defending its forced vaccine mandates, saying they could also do forced sterilization if they wanted, saying Buck v. Bell is still good law. One of the most morally horrific decisions in American legal history. It was a manufactured decision. Because there weren't really 2 lawyers on both sides. Both lawyers were really on the government side. Then and disproportionately poor women, African Americans were the victim. Then you flash forward 1945. Both of those cases, Jacobson and Buck, were used to establish the Korematsu decision, which said forced detention camps. Said you could, based on just ancestry and based on just the emergency of a war, take away somebody's business, take away somebody's job, take away somebody's right to religious expression, take away their political affiliation, take away their right of political expression, and put them in detention camps, which is about 90% of what these lockdowns did. So they're really trying. But what happened is the Nazi experience was so morally horrifying to the world that in 1947, we all got together, passed the Nuremberg Code of 1947, and said this is never going to happen again. Informed consent will now be a guaranteed universal right, something called jus cogens in the international law. Just like piracy is internationally condemned by every court system in the world, outside of maybe Somalia, the same is true of the right of informed consent. But the reality is, ever since informed consent went in, the people that love the state power grabs of the eugenics era have always been wondering is there a way we could sneak this back in? And they've been using the pandemic as a pretext to try all of it out. And so that's why they're trying Korematsu type powers, Buck type powers, Jacobson type powers to do so. Now, Jacobson, in my view, is not good law anymore anyway. But even if it were, Jacobson was an unusual set of facts. You had a smallpox epidemic with a vaccine that had more than a century of being tested as safe and effective. And smallpox, and that the only penalty was you paid a $5 fine if you chose not to get vaccinated.
What year was this, Robert?
1905. So my guess, I think when I've looked at it, it's something like a couple of $100. So it was a very small fine for a very dangerous disease for a very safe vaccine. Totally different than the circumstances we're facing here anyway. But Jacobson was the only decision cited as the power to do forced sterilizations. And then those two decisions cited as the basis to do forced detention camps. So I think the scarier thing is they're trying to reinstate the eugenics era back of state power back. They're trying to restore it. Like you have these liberals citing a decision, and some of them are even citing Buck v. Bell, not understanding what they're citing. They don't realize they're citing one of the most morally horrifying decisions in history. You might as well be citing the Tuskegee experiment to say, well, we did this, so surely we can do this other thing now. Yeah. And for those that don't know, that was where they told people that they were giving them treatment for a disease, and they weren't, just to monitor how bad the disease would hurt them, knowing it would hurt them and their family and their loved ones. And they did it for about 30 years in America. You go back to the mustard gas experiments on U.S. soldiers, radioactivity experiments on both soldiers and patients. They did it right here in Las Vegas. I mean, Eisenhower encouraged tourists to go out and watch the nuclear bombs, despite them knowing internally that created risk of radioactive poisoning. Then there was secret radioactive poisoning going on in the 50s and 60s, and MK Ultra, and Agent Orange in Vietnam, and Gulf War syndrome. You can go on and on. When the government starts experimenting, it almost never turns out good. Or you could just, almost every rushed vaccine in history has backfired. The most famous one being the swine flu pandemic of 1976. Ford panicked, rushed a vaccine, ended up being a complete disaster. The vaccine ended up being far more dangerous than the disease ever was. Despite all of that, they're trying to, this is about a power grab. To basically, you no longer control your own body. You can't even have employment or travel or leave your house or education or pursue your own business or go into a store, go into a restaurant, buy groceries, any even basic necessities of human existence, unless you agree that the government controls what goes in your body, even if what goes in your body is something that has not been approved by the FDA as safe and effective yet, and even if it's to inoculate against a disease that's not dangerous to most people.
Yeah. So I want to unpack that a little bit here. I wrote down some notes, and I read a Time article that referenced kind of some of the laws that were in effect, I believe in the late 1800s, around 1905, the time. And I guess at the border that they had smallpox vaccination checks. Now, what's interesting here, and I think that we need to make note of this for anyone who's, anyone listening, whether you're a proponent of vaccine mandates or not, and that's that according to this Time article, they required that you have a vaccination, or they required that you had something stating that you had the vaccine, or they would see scars, I guess, on your arm that would show them that you would have the vaccine. Or what they would do is they would look at your face, because I guess if you had had smallpox, it would leave scarring on your face, and therefore, if you had had smallpox before, then they would go ahead and let you in, because you would have some sort of built-up immunity that would be consistent with what you would have with a vaccine. Where today, what I see as one of the big differences is they're not asking people, like New York City as an example, they're not saying, hey, show me proof of a vaccine or show me proof that you have COVID antibodies and therefore have some sort of immunity. And let's not forget here, the vaccines only are, what, 60, 70% effective? Even that's, the CDC is telling this, maybe lower.
I mean, it varies. I mean, what the official fact sheet says is, like, for example, a lot of employers and government agencies right now, state and local government agencies, are mass lying to people saying that the FDA has approved these vaccines as safe and effective. They've said neither. The official fact sheet that the FDA puts out says they haven't approved that this vaccine is safe and effective. They say the vaccine might be effective to limit the risk of getting COVID. Their own data
or having severe effects. Yeah,
exactly, and severe effects of it. They say it might have a lot of severe side effects. It lists what some of those side effects are, but it points out that it doesn't know the long-term side effects because not enough studies have been done. And this is an experimental vaccine. It's using mRNA technology. We've never used that in a vaccine before. So we don't know what 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years data shows. And I think, and some of the people's concerns, people like Dr. Robert Maloney, who was one of the key people to introduce mRNA as a platform to use as vaccines, he has been harshly critical of these vaccine mandates. One of the famous, very strong pro-vaccine, Gates Foundation former guy, has always said all the way through his concerns with Brett Weinstein that he voiced. And I can't pronounce his name. It's like Dr. Greet, and then it's like too many other words. It's like all my Wisconsin law classmates that had like Polish names. I'm like, just give me your first name. I'm never getting that last name right. God bless. But he pointed out, he said, in the middle of a pandemic with something like coronavirus, the great risk is that you will actually expand the amount of, he calls it leaky vaccines, that will easily evade and escape. That if you do a mass vaccination in the middle of a pandemic, he was concerned of the risk that it would actually increase both the lethality and effectiveness of variants. And we're starting to see a lot of data that seems to suggest that's happening. The biggest concern is that 3 of the countries that have the most vaccinated populations, Israel, Iceland, and Gibraltar, where it's well over 90%, some cases like 95, 98, 99%, they're seeing explosions in cases so bad that all 3 countries are talking about locking down. And that wasn't supposed to happen if the vaccine was both safe and effective. Then you have the reporting that's taking place, both under the U.S., under the VAERS system, the vaccine adverse event reporting system, and the European system. And they're reporting more deaths and severe adverse events than all of the vaccines combined that their systems have tracked for the last 20 years. So there's concerns about, this is so experimental. It hasn't reached any FDA formal full approval. There's citizen petitions pending that haven't even been answered that raise a lot of scientific and medical questions. And in that and there's major efficacy questions based on existing countries. Is this the right time to force everyone to take this when we have never in American government history ever forced the entire country to take any vaccine? Even in the middle of raging smallpox epidemics, there was never a federal mandate. There was never an employer mandate. The only mandates that have ever been allowed are for proven safe vaccines for school children for very lethal diseases in order to attend public schools. And even there were exceptions for religious objections, exceptions for medical objections. Some states have just exceptions for ethical or philosophical bases. About 15 states in America have that. Or it was the military, or it was a local government in the middle of a peak pandemic that did something like the Jacobson case, where in Massachusetts it's getting really bad. They're quarantining a community. They're saying if you want access to this community, you have to be vaccinated or have previously had the infection. And then even then, the consequence was only a small fine, not compared to lose your job, lose the right to go out to eat, lose the right to go to a grocery store, lose the right to go to your own family member's funeral or wedding, which is what we've been doing. And then you add to that, these vaccine mandates are not allowing any exemption for people who've already been infected. Yeah. Even though people have already been infected, all the data so far shows that they are more protected against any reinfection than people who are vaccinated that had not been previously infected. So that prior exception you referenced that existed back then, whereas if you'd previously had smallpox, no requirement to get the vaccine, they're not extending that in the COVID context, despite the robust data suggesting that they should. So we are facing unprecedented, unparalleled times. That the closest analogy is the government seizing the kind of power they did during the eugenics era, which is what birthed when the Nazis cited their moral and legal authority to do eugenics. They cited the United States Supreme Court. We should not return back to that era.
Yeah, and for those of the viewers who might be a little younger and might not have heard the term eugenics, can you explain that?
Sure. So eugenics was basically an evolved version of social political evolution, taking the scientific theory of Darwinism and taking that scientific theory and saying, you know what, the reason why we, the rich and powerful and certain ancestries and other groups have the power and wealth we have is because we're actually superior, where we're the survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
And so then they took that another step further and they said, you know what, we need to engineer our society to only let the fit people survive. And people should look at what some of these pro-mandate people are saying on Twitter. I mean, they're saying things like, I hope the unvaccinated die. I'm glad we're segregating these people. They're saying that they're using the language of eugenics, which is that a certain group of people are superior by genes to other people, and that they should have to be able to use the power of government and the power of their collective wealth to be able to get rid of the parts of the population that they see as inferior. And it disparately targeted people based on race, based on ancestry, based on socioeconomic standing. But the idea of eugenics doesn't have to be limited to racism or class-based standards. It's the idea that one group of humans should rule another group of humans, including being able to effectively exterminate them, which is what forced sterilization was. And the Nazis just took eugenics to its logical conclusion, frankly. And people were so morally horrified at witnessing that we said never again, and yet here we are where they're trying to do it again.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with the Jim Crow laws. And I've mentioned this on Twitter, and the pushback that you get there is, well, this is completely different because that was regarding someone's skin color, which they have absolutely no control over. But this is regarding a vaccine that you could just go down to your local Walmart and grab in 5 minutes for free. But I said, and what they're doing there is they're missing my point. Because when I talk about the Jim Crow laws, it wasn't referencing the business to the consumer. And that's what most people, that's the first thing that comes to their mind. It was the government to the business. See, think about what the government was doing. They were banning businesses from serving certain customers. And they're doing the exact same thing in New York now. They're banning restaurants and gyms, etc., from serving certain Americans. So the relationship, although it may be slightly different between the business and the customer, between the government and the business, it's the exact same thing. And I don't see how we can look back at Jim Crow just horrified and then look at, as far as what the government did, forcing businesses to do that. And then now all of a sudden we look at what the government is doing now and we say, oh, well, this is great. This is, I support that. I support the government, basically banning businesses from from serving certain customers. It's just, that's unbelievable.
What I tell people, it's like we're living in a bad Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah.
Where we've been pushed back to the 1920s, because if you look at the kind of stuff they're mandating, even things like masks to a certain degree, it's like, oh, okay, we have to have required masks. We're back to eugenics era power of the courts and the government to control our own bodies for our own and the community's broader health. And we're back to segregation based on status. And that's basically like the 1920s Ku Klux Klan platform. I mean, it's like boom, boom, boom. It's that same legal mindset. And not only that, it actually translates that way in the real world. If you look at the disparate impact, one way to sue under racial discrimination laws is to show that a particular policy may not be overtly racist, but if it disparately impacts a racial minority group, it's considered discriminatory. And then the other side has to prove why that it wasn't just pretextual what they did. Well, take New York City. There's a 40-point gap between vaccination rates amongst white and non-white, particularly black New Yorkers. That there's a large number of black New Yorkers who disproportionately got COVID the first time around, by the way. So they're one of the groups that is already had COVID and is being told they have to get vaccinated. Disproportionately, they might as well just say no blacks allowed in New York City, because most of these impacts of this mandate in New York City will heavily just be on black New Yorkers.
Yeah, see, that's a great point. I didn't even think about that. And so let's go into a little bit of the legality or lack thereof with what's going on, because I know my concern is, first and foremost, well, let me back up a little bit. I think as someone who has chosen not to be vaccinated, and again, I want to be very clear, I am not anti-vaccine. I am pro-freedom. I'm not anti-vaccine. So if you want to go out there and get a vaccine, if you look at your risk reward and you come to your own conclusion, you aren't forced, you aren't coerced, but you come to your own conclusion that it's smart for you to get a vaccine, then go get one. I have no issue with that whatsoever. My issue is when the government, number one, forces businesses to only serve a certain group, but then also when if governments like we see in France are forcing their citizens to inject a foreign substance into their body. That's where I really draw the line, because that's when it starts to go from a health issue to a freedom and liberty issue. But my big concern here, Robert, is that other cities, take the same approach as New York, and within a year or two, I can't go, or 150 million Americans who choose not to get a vaccine can't go to certain cities. And then to take it to the next step, can't get on a plane. I read something on the Atlantic where they were suggesting, in fact, the gal that was in charge of Homeland Security for Obama, I can't recall her name, but she was suggesting that we should have a no-fly list for those who have not been vaccinated. So think about that. We could live in a world where, or in a country where half the cities 150 million Americans can't go, and then 150 million Americans aren't allowed to fly. So am I seeing things correctly, or am I blowing it? Am I getting too concerned, or how should I be looking at this?
Actually, understating the risk. I think within a month or two, we're going to be facing people getting fired from their jobs unless they get vaccinated, even if they have a religious exception, even if they have a medical exemption, even if they previously had COVID, because that's already happening. I think cities, counties, and states across the country are going to be mandating it. The U.S. military apparently is going to require it of its own soldiers by mid-September. You're going to see schools mandate it for children. You're going to see hospitals require you be vaccinated, or you can't even get medical care. They won't allow you access it. That's already starting to happen. You're not going to be allowed to be a nurse or a doctor unless you get vaccinated. You won't be able to practice your medical profession. They may start to require it as a condition of legal profession and other licensures, occupational licensures, that you will lose your license. Maybe even to be something like a roofer or a contractor if you don't get vaccinated.
Oh, I'm sure they'll do it for people who cut hair and do nails and everything.
Absolutely. They did it to January 6th defendants. The January 6th defendants that were detained in what they call the deplorable jail, they were not allowed to have their beard trimmed or their hair cut unless they took a vaccine, this vaccine. The no-fly list are definitely coming sooner rather than later, but it may go further than that. We're already seeing cruise ships, despite the Florida rule that said you can't require vaccine passports. They went to federal court, found a friendly judge, and said, yes, you can, despite Florida's law, not even allowing a state government to enforce a law prohibiting vaccine passports. A court is allowing cruise ships to do so despite the state law. It will likely extend to Amtrak and train travel, likely then extend to any interstate common carrier. They've already asserted the same power in the mass context over Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and taxi drivers. So pretty soon what will happen is you can't take any form of public transit. You can't take any form of private transit, maybe other than your own car. They may convert toll stations into vaccine check stations. As you note, that was one of the ways they enforced the smallpox one back in the early 1900s. And so not only do you pass the toll, you have to have your vaccine passport identification card, which my view is what they're going to do. There's already stories building. They're going to start saying it's critical first to get the vaccine, second to have proof of it, and then third, they'll say, you know what, there's too many fake IDs out there, too many fake vaccine IDs. We really need something that's a little more permanent. And if you look at the technologies that Bill Gates has backed over the last 10 years, and he's the biggest pusher of this particular politicized agenda, it's a quantum tattoo. And what the quantum tattoo, which is basically a chip in your body, what that does is he has helped develop the patents to make and helped fund the organizations getting the patents to check what vaccines you've had, what ones you haven't had. Ultimately, he has technology that ties it into digital currency, digital identification, everything. They're going to say, we can't trust the vaccine IDs. You need to get a quantum tattoo. You need to get a chip in your skin that will make sure that you're reliable, the information is trustworthy, and you're safe. And that then it's very easy to use that technology to impose a Chinese social credit type system on the entire world, wherever, and that's what makes it most functional and effective. So that's the path that we are on. And it's the path we've really been on for a year, but it's accelerating fast. I mean, just within the last week, I've received hundreds of contacts from employees all across the country that either the local government or their employer is demanding that they get vaccinated right away, within a week or two, and that if they don't, they will be fired. And this includes people that have worked 20, 25, 30 years, people that are even working remotely or could work remotely, who pose no health, people who previously had COVID, so they pose no risk of any kind. So this suggests a coordinated effort. You don't see big corporations like Walmart and Disney and Tyson talking about all of this unless somebody at a very high level said, let's attack. One of the first companies to do so was Goldman Sachs, started on its Utah employees 2 weeks ago. So when I see that, that means then next coming up is governments. They'll start with New York and San Francisco and LA. Governor Newsom is already talking about it today for the entire state of California, and right on the eve of his recall, where the only thing you don't need ID for, of course, is to vote. You could do that right from home in California. You can just print the ballots. Why can't we print a vaccine identification passport right from our own homes? If it's good enough to vote, just let me print my little, I tell people I identify as vaccinated. You can identify as different genders these days. Why can't I identify as vaccinated? And like most of the people in this space, most of us are not anti-vax at all. It'd be like for all the times I've sued drug companies, people say, well, Barnes is just anti-medicine because he sued drug companies when they produce bad drugs. It's like, no, I'm opposed to drugs that don't meet certain levels of safety and whatnot. But in this context, I have no personal opinion about the vaccine itself. My only personal opinion is informed consent must matter. And Nuremberg Code was all about never again. And I see the powers that be trying to make it happen again. And that I don't want the eugenics era of legal precedents that give the state complete power over our own bodies to come back. And that's my legal concern, and that everybody should get to make their choice that's good for them. I've had family members get vaccinated. Others choose not to. Friends get vaccinated. Others choose not to. That's their right, and it should always be their right, not the state's prerogative.
What do you say to people that come back and say, Robert, I get what you're saying. It all makes sense. But if we don't have these vaccine mandates, all those dummies, all those rubes out there that are too stupid to get vaccinated are going to fill up all of the hospitals. They're going to take up all the ICU beds. And therefore, there's going to be no ICU beds left for those individuals who were responsible enough to get the vaccine. So although you may think this is an individual issue, it's really an issue for the greater good of society.
I think my concern is that if our measurement for coerced medicine is no longer a very dangerous disease like smallpox, but instead is ICU capacity, we're going to get down a very tricky path, particularly something like ICU capacity that the government can choose to shrink or expand. So if they can say, if we are worried about any ICU capacity, we can just send somebody to your door and inject something into your system without your consent, without you necessarily even being informed of all the risks, even if it's an emergency product, not a product that has met rigorous FDA testing for actually being designated safe and effective, which are sort of magical words within the FDA language, and no COVID vaccine has met that yet, then there's no limitations. And ultimately, bodily autonomy matters more, and it matters more than ICU capacity, because it's always a choice question. Who do we trust more? Do we trust leaving the power in the hands of the individual, or letting the state have a monopoly over it? And history tells us, just as a practical matter, that aside from philosophical issues, you give the state that monopoly, it almost never turns out well. You trust the individual, it almost always does. And that's what our founders did. Our founders could have had an emergency exception of the Constitution. They went through real epidemics, nothing like what we went through last year. Take last year, multiply it times 100. I think they went through 7 smallpox epidemics between the Revolutionary era and the final passing of the Constitution.
And just to be clear, smallpox killed like 30% of the people who were infected.
Absolutely. 1/3 and of all age groups. I mean, unlike when I hear people say, oh, you can choose whether to get vaccinated and that impacts things. 95%, according to the CDC, 95% of the people who have died from COVID had comorbidities. And the average number was 4 comorbidities, and their average age was over 75. So, this limits it's only a very small group that's really at risk. According to the UK data, the Delta variant for healthy working age populations that did not have a comorbidity under 65 was the same rate as the general case fatality rate for the flu. So and then that's the history of coronaviruses. One of the big concerns also here is we have so suppressed different dissident opinions. And this includes, Brett Weinstein, a guy on the left, Eric Weinstein, his brother, on the left, Robert Malone, medical guy, but big pro-vaccine advocates like the Dr. Greek guy and others. And the Alex Berenson, longtime liberal New York Times journalist. They're the ones saying there are serious problems here about whether this is even good public health policy. And unfortunately, like Bobby Kennedy, another guy on the left, you couldn't have a bigger liberal Democratic name in America than somebody with the last name Kennedy. And he's the most famous son of that family. And the FDA has not filed one answer in response to his detailed citizen petition that all raises scientific questions and medical questions that go right to the heart of whether this is even good policy. So you could I believe in individual informed consent above pretty much anything. It's got to be Walking Dead zombie level threats for me to say, okay, maybe you can condition access to certain communities based on having a certain medication. But that's got to be a very different evidentiary standard. People can go back and watch the debate I had with Alan Dershowitz on Viva Fry's channel several months ago, and Dershowitz, extreme pro-vaccine advocate, particularly in this context. He wants everybody on planes to be vaccinated. But he agreed that legally the standard should be there has to be clear and convincing evidence, objective evidence, that you pose a substantial risk of severe harm to a good number of people unless you are vaccinated, and that no other mitigation technique or tactic or other alternative is out there.
Based on him stating that, agreeing to that, how does he still maintain his position?
Because there's been so much censorship of independent information that I am finding the amount of ignorance. I put it out today. I said, anybody that if we did a test and we tested people who are opposed to the vaccine mandates versus those who are for the vaccine mandates on basic questions about this disease and about this vaccine, I would predict in advance and bet whatever amount anybody wanted to bet that consistently those who oppose vaccine mandates will be much more informed about both the disease and the vaccines than the people that are for the mandates. And it's because, like, Dershowitz takes for granted. He really believes, he actually said this. He thought that COVID was as dangerous as smallpox. And it's like, how do you believe this? But it's because, I mean, right now,
well, if you listen to CNN all day long, Robert, I mean, even you and I, if you and I were just, if someone locked us into a chair and taped open our eyeballs, like you see on the cartoons, or like Zoolander. Remember that scene in Zoolander where they try to brainwash him? I mean,
famously, Clockwork Orange. That was Stanley Kubrick.
What was that?
We're living through a Stanley Kubrick film because he in Clockwork Orange has the guy's eyes.
Yeah,
forced
exactly.
open.
Yeah, if you do that to even one of us, and make us watch CNN for a month straight, or MSNBC or any of the mainstream media, we would come away with the same conclusion.
Absolutely. I debate family members on this, and they're so. I mean, the levels of condescension and arrogance, they don't realize that's not really a good persuasion technique. To keep telling people I'm better than you, that's why you should believe what I believe. But putting that aside, they really believe it. They have not even heard. Like I was talking to a friend who's a judge. He had not heard that any doctor had raised any questions about this whatsoever. And I was like, the guy who helped design the very vaccine that's being used, the very technology that's being used, he says mandates are a bad idea. And he hadn't heard of it. So, I mean, it's incredible. And it's where this is the first real experiment. The 2020 election was in bits and pieces. But this is the first massive public policy where the big tech, big media, big government collusion of censoring and suppressing dissident information has led people that are pro-mandate to not have basic functional literacy in informations related to either the disease or to this vaccine.
Or history of just, what we've been talking about throughout this interview.
I mean, exactly. When I tell people, by the way, did you know in 1976, they rushed a vaccine. 2 years later, they figured out it was a total disaster, that it caused more severe effects than it cured. Nobody knows about it. It's like,
I didn't know that.
Some people tell me I'm making it up. And I'm like, that was 60 Minutes that ran that story. I mean, it was like, no, I'm not, this isn't, it wasn't Alex Jones, it wasn't my source. Even though right now we should all be putting lots of tips in the Alex Jones tip jar.
Yeah.
Alex Jones was right tip jar. I mean, it's like 1 week after the next, after the next, after the next. But I was like, but this is 60 Minutes that's reported this. A lot of the data that I talk about, people say that can't be right. And to give an example, Twitter censored a journalist the other day for quoting the CDC. They didn't realize he was quoting the CDC because people forget the CDC has not said any COVID vaccine is safe and effective yet. Right. They've said it might work, it might be effective, and it might be really bad. And we have no idea how long it could be effective. And we have no idea if long-term it could screw you. That's it. All we've said is this is enough for emergency authorization, not whether it's safe and effective, which are magical terms that can only be applied once they give it a full license. People don't know that. You're seeing city government, City of Richmond, put out saying the FDA has determined this is as safe or more safe and effective than any vaccine they've ever looked at. It's totally false. FDA's never said that. I get maybe Chris Cuomo or Don Lemon was saying it on CNN. It's utterly false. But that's the kind of, they are so misinformed and we're seeing the effect of the censorship. You go back to Robert Epstein's work, and he said the more censorship that occurs, the more people tend to believe in the censored information because they trust big tech as the gatekeeper. And so they think, well, this must really be true then. I mean, it's a perverse effect for those of us that like to think independently. But we're seeing the product of it. About half of the country believes every media lie that they've heard, every government lie that they've heard about this. And they're ignorant of two things: the actual facts they would know from just going to actual government sites, if you look at the actual data or studies, but also if they'd listened to dissident information, or, as you point out, if they just knew our history. There's a long, long history of governments lying about this kind of stuff.
Right, but Robert, even if they just look at one source, say the CDC and the WHO, the World Health Organization, and look at how many times, or Fauci, and look at how many times they have contradicted themselves. Just days later. It's not that, oh, well, they got new information. You can't have that much new information in the span of 2 days to have such drastically different views or different messages. I mean, even if I was someone that was way on the side of being pro-vaccine mandate, and this is what I encourage, those people to do, hopefully through my videos, and if some of them watch or my tweets or social media, is don't believe me, but just ask yourself, just start to question, just kind of scratch your head and say, why are they doing that? One example I used is the WHO's definition for herd immunity. And back in, I think it was roughly June of 2020, their definition for herd immunity included two things. Number one, vaccination, and number two, immunity to a certain degree through having the virus in the first place and surviving. What we talked about. If you get COVID, you have a certain degree of immunity, even with the Delta variant, a degree of immunity that would probably be consistent, or maybe, to your point, even better than what we've seen with some of the vaccines. So there, and I remember when I started talking about the COVID back in January of 2020, and all these people that are now calling me a tinfoil hatter and a conspiracy theorist for just scratching my head and saying, wait a minute, this CDC stuff, it doesn't seem right. These vaccine mandates don't seem right. All these people that are calling me a tinfoil hatter now are the same people that were calling me a tinfoil hatter and a conspiracy theorist back in January 2020 when I started talking about COVID in the first place, saying, hey guys, wait a minute, this is something that you might want to pay attention to. This is something that if it takes hold, the governments could lock us in our homes. They could require us to wear masks. We could see, a police state. And everyone's, oh, George, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. And sure enough, then we go straight into 2020. But going back to my point there, the WHO on their website said that herd immunity could be achieved through vaccination and or through the people in the population actually getting the virus. Then what happened once the vaccinations came out, call it November of 2020, they changed their definition of herd immunity and only used the vaccination part. So they changed their entire definition of herd immunity to say that you could only achieve herd immunity through vaccination. They omitted the part about being, having immunity or herd immunity through actually getting the virus. So that in and of itself, you have to, even if you're the most pro-vaccine mandate person, you've got to kind of scratch your head and say, wait a minute, why would they do that? Like that doesn't make any sense to me. Isn't it a little coincidental? And then in December, of course, they flipped it back because they had so many complaints and people pointed it out. And then then of course they changed, and then they had some sort of caveat there that said they would prefer that people, or that we reached herd immunity through vaccination. But that's my main message here is, guys, if you study history, once people abandon critical thinking, it takes us down a very, very slippery slope. And I think that's my main message here.
Absolutely. And my other concern with all of this has been we've skipped all the processes. We have a process in the West for determining, and in America especially, for determining whether something is true or not. And the part of that process on the governmental side is that we make sure it goes through the legislative process, then the executive process, then the judicial process. And within the judicial process, we make sure we have robust discovery, robust evidence presented, robust evidentiary hearings, and real trials with juries in most cases. We've skipped pretty much all of that. These have just been random government mandates by just one branch of the government that didn't even follow their own internal rules. Like the FDA is required to answer these citizen petitions. They're not. There's supposed to be notice and comment before any of these mandates were done to allow people to participate. You have a right to petition under the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There's an obligation to allow citizen participation under these rules and regulations. They didn't even follow those. And anytime any public health intervention in the lockdown, mask, or other context has gone to an actual evidentiary hearing in the United States, the government has not been able to produce any evidence that supports their position to a substantial degree. They've lost every single one of those. What most courts have done is never allowed an evidentiary hearing to be conducted, never allowed discovery to take place. That's what happened in the recent vaccine mandate by the University of Indiana that now is going up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so in the constitutional context, so that's my biggest, is the methods we have to ascertain whether something is true and who and what to believe. We've abandoned all of those methods. The whole idea will have separate branches of government that will be adequate checks to make sure there's not an abuse of power and to make sure that information is also accurate and true. We abandoned it for the last year. Same is true in terms of the entire judicial process. We're not using the discovery tools. We're not using the trial techniques. We're not using the standards of evidence that we've developed for 300 years. Yeah. Rules of evidence about how to trust this piece of information or not trust that piece of information. Because like what you said is correct. None of these people can stand up to cross-examination because they've contradicted themselves over the last year repeatedly. I mean, just today, you could see one CNN post that says 99.9% of people who've been vaccinated have not received COVID. And then you might also in a later post see that even the vaccinated face major risk, and that's why we have to do mask mandates and lockdowns.
Right.
And it's like, those statements don't work together. Something there is off. And yet that's what we're seeing on a regular basis. Masks being the most egregious version. I've called this a live Milgram experiment to see how much the government can get away with, how much consent they can get from the public, how many rights they can get them to forfeit, because they'll only come back as privileges. You know, as Milton Friedman always says, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. We're going to find that's very true in this context. But no better example of that than the mask mandate. We went from February and March of 2020 being told it's ridiculous that you're wearing a mask. You don't need a mask. To April and May of 2020, you absolutely better wear a mask or you're doomed. It's like, well, which was it? They reversed
and the data didn't change, by the way. The scientific studies didn't change from that first month to the second month.
No, not within 30 days. I mean, I tell people about vaccines. It's like the average length of time for a vaccine to reach governmental approval, where we can really feel confident saying it's safe and effective, is 12 years. And we're going to do this in 12 months? Just go back and read some of what Kamala Harris was saying, what Joe Biden was saying on the campaign trail. Biden said, don't trust any vaccine until you have total transparency from the government. Kamala Harris said, you shouldn't trust a vaccine that's rushed this quickly. You know, I mean, when they got elected, suddenly all those rules changed magically. So we have all the reasons to question it. And then you go back, it depends on who's doing the mandate. If a government official is doing the mandate, then the Constitution applies. If it's a private actor, then I believe common law tort and the Americans with Disabilities Act and maybe other civil rights laws apply. Because
can you go into that, Robert? Because that was one of my questions, because I'm someone, I mean, you know, I'm all about free market capitalism. And I think that a business should be able to hire or fire anyone for any reason, regardless of how morally reprehensible I think it is. It's because that's your business. So you get to do with your business what you want. So push back on me. How am I wrong there from a standpoint of, forget the government now. We're not talking about the government. We're talking about the businesses like Amazon or United Airlines saying that, hey, workers, you have to get a vaccine or you're fired. I don't know if you saw the story the other day. CNN fired a couple of their employees for actually coming into the office prior to getting a vaccine.
Well, my view is I think the civil rights laws reached a reasonable compromise because the civil rights laws don't apply to really small businesses. It says once you reach a certain level of economic power, which usually is about 15 employees, once you have a certain degree of economic power, we're going to put certain limitations on how you can use that economic power.
So you think those small businesses under 15 employees still should have the right to, you know, if they want the vaccines, and you got the right to force your employees to do it, or they can look for another job?
Yeah, and that's what the current law is for the most part. It depends on where you are within the components. But for the most part, if you're a real small employer, self-employed, you can do whatever you want to do.
Okay.
If you have more than 15 employees is the typical threshold. There's some states that differentiate. In California, they have so many crazy laws, you don't know which ones apply at which point. But so that's why I said nothing's universal. It's a crazy quilt. But generally speaking, under federal law, the risk for an employer and the potential protection for an employee is if it's not a government employer, then is the ADA, common law tort of battery, and some other civil rights laws. The ADA, people are assuming the ADA doesn't apply. My view is it does apply. What ADA was all a reflection of what happened during the AIDS panic in the 1980s. That people panicked not knowing how you could get HIV.
Right. I remember that. I remember it well.
Mass discrimination against people. There was discrimination against family members just because they were taking care of someone with HIV or AIDS. Magic Johnson famously had to leave the NBA because other players were paranoid, thinking if they bumped into him, somehow they would get HIV or AIDS.
I remember
Fauci in particular didn't quite help this when early in the 80s he said you could get HIV if you walking into the kitchen. So, he said some nutty things towards the beginning of that process. He's made famous by his HIV research. I'm not sure it's well deserved. And of course, there's actually a theory that rushing the polio vaccine in Belgium during the Belgian government's reign there in the late 1950s was, according to a journalist who wrote a book called The River, spent 10 years detailing it and documenting it, may have been the reason for AIDS in the first place. So just another reminder, rushing vaccines can have massive risk, particularly when we're talking about mass vaccinations. Because if something goes AWOL, that effect is out there to hundreds of millions of people, not a limited group. And then that's the other thing with this. We've never done mass levels of a new medical drug on 100 million plus people in the history of the world. I mean, this is novel at so many levels. And yet we're short-circuiting all the traditional mechanisms we use to ascertain truth and make sure we're right. But in the employment context, my view is if your employer looks at you and thinks of you as being physically limited because of being unvaccinated, sees you as immunocompromised or immunity deficient, as being more susceptible to getting a transmissible deadly disease, then under the ADA, that is exactly what's protected. Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't just protect actual disabilities. It protects you from when other people think you're disabled. They think you have a physical limitation. And so in my experience, a lot of employers are rushing into this because I've told employers that I represent it's a bad idea to do the vaccine mandate. You might get sued under the ADA. You might get sued because basically if you discriminate, under the ADA, it's almost exactly the same standard that Dershowitz agreed is the constitutional standard.
And then what if the employee has a negative reaction to the vaccine itself? Wouldn't the employer then be liable?
That's the second risk. It's not clear. I've told employees, I've told employers as well, but told employees if they're requiring the vaccine and you're nervous about it, at a minimum, don't sign any waivers because sometimes that's buried in the small print, and ask your employer, by the way, is my medical insurance through you or your insurance going to cover this? Because they're going to find, I'm hearing reports of insurers saying they're not going to cover injuries from the vaccine itself. And of course, you can't sue the vaccine maker, the vaccine producer, the vaccine distributor, the doctor, the medical facility. All of them are immune, completely immune under federal law. And that preempts all state law, which is one of my problems. My problem is when you remove skin in the game. I agree with Nassim Taleb on this. When you take skin in the game where there's only rewards and no risk, and that's pretty much it for Pfizer. I mean, I think Moderna's stock is up 300% in the last 3 months, something like that. Saw some chart on it. Well, of course it is. It's all reward, no risk. If this turns out bad, no problem. They can't be sued. If it turns out good, they might have something that you're going to need every couple of months. And that's the other thing with this. This is not going to be like the vaccines most people are familiar with. There's going to be booster after booster after booster after booster for the rest of your life. The goal, I think, from a Bill Gates perspective, is to condition the West to believe, to accept the government's going to come and put something in your body. They need to do it on a regular basis. It's good for the world. Go along with it. Because this has been his ideology for his whole life. He believes it's keys to reducing population. You can draw your own inferences whether that's a great idea. Whether it's a great idea that someone's saying, please have more vaccinations because that's going to reduce the population by making the world safer. One could argue whether that's a logical connection. But putting that aside, that's where I think it's ultimately going. But under the ADA, they have to prove, if you're the employer, you're going to have to prove it was business necessity. And that means objective evidence that this person presented a substantial risk of severe harm that you couldn't mitigate by any other mechanism. And so if they already have the infection, then that's a better mechanism than the vaccine. Could you do it by just just asking them to be tested before they come into employment during a certain time period? Because ultimately, all these mandates are only dealing with one small risk category, asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people. Because people who are symptomatic with COVID, you just send them home. So they don't come in. You could do temperature checks for that. So, or you could just require that, hey, if you're symptomatic, you can't come in. So this is only dealing with the risk that someone who's pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic spreads the virus in ways that the vaccine prevents. And the probability of someone asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spreading it to someone and causing severe harm within the employment context is minuscule. You're talking 100,000 to 1 kind of odds. You're talking flu level kind of odds. And I don't think employers realize that. So I think if they get sued under the ADA and the courts determine, yes, indeed, the ADA applies, they're subjecting themselves to massive liability. And that doesn't even get to the liability you're talking about. You've now made it as an employer a condition of employment to get the vaccine. What happens if the vaccine causes, say, infertility? What happens if it causes a severe problem? I mean, those kind of cases are 7-figure cases. You could go bankrupt by pushing this proposal. And you could probably be sued under various civil rights laws. And if you're not careful, you could be sued under HIPAA. Let's say you get that information and then share it. Or you tell someone who's unvaccinated, well, it's okay as long as you wear a mask. But then everybody knows who the unvaccinated person is. Haven't you publicly disclosed private medical information to other employees? So there's just risk after risk after risk. And I think they're trying to get mass compliance by having these big, powerful corporations force it first, with some government mandates in the behind the scenes. But I think this is something that would only hurt your small business over time, because Amazon can afford if it gets sued. Your local business can't. So I think they're exposing themselves to risk. They can also be sued for battery, because it'd be like, let's say you came to me, George, you said, okay, I want to work for you. And I said, okay, as long as you go down to Joe's bar and get beat up by Jack and Joe over there, then you can have the job.
Right.
Well, haven't I kind of
like a hazing, like an employment hazing.
Exactly. Well, haven't I kind of conspired to commit battery? So, and you could be subject to potential battery lawsuits under the common law torts. So which is separate from the ADA. So, maybe all the judges will rush in to protect all the governments and employers. But if you're a small, medium-sized employer, you're taking a much bigger risk. And you're thinking, oh, well, Amazon did it. Walmart did it. All these other people did it. Surely you'll be fine. Not to mention the high-quality employees you're going to lose. I mean, if I was an employer right now, I would be marketing. If I was a big employer, I'd be marketing, hey, I don't care if you've been vaccinated. Come work for me. And right now I'd have a heck of a market edge. And think about the kind of people that are unvaccinated are probably going to be the kind of independent thinkers and highly productive people, a lot more so than your average vaccinated person, would be my guess. Your average vaccinated person is probably sitting at home, not paying that, hoping that eviction moratorium keeps going on for a couple of more months and waiting for the stimmy check, one more stimmy check to come in. Right. So so I think that it's a bad idea from a business perspective, in my view, to mandate the vaccines from the employer's perspective, independent of the employee's perspective.
Yeah, got it. And I want to make sure I'm emphasizing the point to the viewers and listeners who might be pro vaccine mandate. And again, I don't want to pass judgment on anybody here. I'm not saying that people are stupid or, just because I don't agree with them. But one thing I'd encourage those people to think through is you are giving the government a tremendous amount of power. Now, you may believe that's justified in this case, but by giving them that power, they're never going to give it back. And what's going to end up happening in the future is sooner or later, the government is going to use that power that you gave them against you. That's the way this works. Or they're going to use it to support a cause that you do not agree with. Or they're going to use it to destroy some sort of cause that you do agree with. That's the way these things work. Once you give the government that power, it's not like they'll only use that power in the future to do what you think is right. And that's one of the main messages that I want to get through to people. But I want to go back to what you were saying with the microchip, because I think a lot of viewers would say, "Oh, Barnes, you're just, you've been hanging out with Jones too long, and you're not seeing things clearly. That's never going to happen." I would encourage those people to go to the World Economic Forum's website and just do some research. Don't take my word on it. Don't take Barnes's word on it. Don't take Alex Jones's word on it. I don't know if Jones is talking about this, but go to the World Economic Forum's website. Go read what Klaus Schwab says about microchips and using that for health purposes, and that he goes so far, and with the blog posts that are on his website, to say that it would submit people's dreams and thoughts as well as their vital signs to this database that would be controlled by the government or the World Health Organization or the World Economic Forum, IMF, who knows, by the central planners, and that they would use artificial intelligence to somehow make our lives better and take us into this utopian society. So it's not us saying that. It's the global elite that are coming right out with blog posts on their own website saying that. But what do you think is kind of the end game here? You talked about the Chinese social credit score, that's kind of where this is going. And you talked about Gates, how, this quote unquote has been his objective for a long time. What is this for Bill Gates? What is his objective, and what do you think the end game is here? Why are they doing this if it's not for health reasons?
Complete state control, complete power. It's that those with the most disparate economic power and political power and cultural power can literally physically control your body. I mean, because it's the ultimate form of control. If they can decide what goes into your brain, they can decide what goes into your body. They frankly control you. I mean, it's the equivalent. It's as close as you can get to chattel slavery without fully embracing every aspect of chattel slavery, because controlling the body was the core legal foundation for everything. And once you control that, you basically control the person. And so and they've been trying to, that's why they unleashed it between 1905 and 1945 in the United States, that birthed movements ideologically as its inheritors, like fascism, and to a certain degree, you could say communism, just different forms of state totalitarianism. The idea is that very much they want complete control. And they believe in some of their views, Bill Gates, for example, he thinks it's good for everybody that somebody like him has a lot more power and control. That'll be good for you in the end. It's a very paternalistic perspective, which was very true of the entire quote unquote progressive era in American politics. We know better for you. And it's not a surprise that all the petty authoritarians came out of the woodwork during the last year. And even, your old school teacher friend or anyone else, you discover, whoa, they really do love authority, authority, authority. It's like little Cartman getting the chance to respect my authority kind of routine. We saw it unleashed on a mass scale, and it will continue. And that's what the real objective is. So, and when you're able to start with that, like over a year ago, year and a half now, I started with, okay, if I believed in what Bill Gates did, and what you're talking about is exactly right. People can look up just Bill Gates patents, different connections and you go through. It's like, why did Bill Gates spend as much time and money as he did developing certain patents unless he plans on them being used someday? And anybody, like, the other thing is the younger generation doesn't remember what Microsoft's reputation was under Bill Gates. Those of us who do remember what a ruthless monopolist he was. Crappier product who used economic manipulation to dominate the marketplace. Even the defense industry didn't like him because he built a back door into some things he sold to some people he should. But putting all that aside, you can see where their goal is by looking at their own words, looking at their own actions. And when you do, just like watching Obama's party, it tells you how much do all these people really deeply care about the spread of this disease. Well, if they did, would they hold a big party where none of them have masks for 18 hours or 2 days or 3 days, however long this party is going? it kind of gives you a sense. The same way Newsom sits down at the French Laundry and has a nice meal with no mask or anything else while he's locked down the whole state. That the hypocrisy exposes their duplicity. But the goal is power.
It's exactly what you saw in communist Russia. Same thing.
Absolutely. It's the same thing.
Yes, some animals are more equal than others.
Indeed. And we've seen lots of examples of that Orwellian Animal Farm point over the last year, and we'll continue to, because this is them having ultimate power. And that's why I tell people who maybe for this particular vaccine want to mandate this vaccine, see the virus is very serious. It's like, I understand all that, but unless you, and to Dershowitz's credit, he agreed we have to have strict legal limits on this or it will get out of hand very quickly. He understands how horrifying the Buck v. Bell decision is. So though we disagree about the facts as to how that would work in this context, he recognizes how dangerous this precedent is if we don't do it right. He agrees that nothing should be mandated that doesn't go through the legislative process and from a governmental perspective. He also agrees there needs to be a full, robust trial with a jury trial level before it's mandated at that level. And because we both understand those systems were designed over centuries as the best means to get to truth. Not perfect, but better than just Newsom wakes up one day and says, man, I'd like to have this power. Right. And we're seeing we have a bunch of power drunk politicians around the world that are going to keep drinking until somebody cuts them off at the tap.
How do we do that?
Fighting back at every level, fighting back in the court of public opinion, which matters, fighting back in the courts of law, which matters, fighting back in the courts of politics, where it can be effective at every level. Like one thing some people can do, people that are independent employers, I mean, right now, I think it's to their market edge. They could start to advertise, hey, are they trying to fire you because of vaccination status? Come work for me. I don't care. I don't think it's necessary for you to do your job. And you'll get a bunch of better employees. I'll give an example. Big corporate law firms are demanding this of their lawyers. And they would be surprised at the number of independent lawyers in those big corporate law firms that have no interest in this. And so you have some of the best lawyers in the country right now that may be looking for alternative work because they don't want to be under these kind of restrictions. They're like, hey, I didn't come to work for your law firm so that you get to control my bot. That wasn't part of my deal. So, my recommendation, look at independent market alternatives always. And anybody that has market power can utilize it for that. Anybody that can argue in the court of a public opinion, that still matters. You're seeing a lot of the governments, they'll go forward and they'll pull back. Go forward and they pull back. Because at the end, one of the key aspects to the tap staying running is the court of public opinion. And if that court of public opinion starts to push back, like what's happening in France and Italy and Australia, New Zealand, other countries around the world, that's the only way the governments say, well, hold on a second. The same with even employers. If you think your employer is making a bad decision, and I think they are if they try to do a mandate, just ask them questions like, do you have a religious exemption? Do you have a medical exemption? By the way, have you already talked to your insurer to make sure you're going to pay for anything that goes wrong if it's the vaccine that goes wrong on this? Because you might be paying that tab. And saying, if none of those exemptions work for you and they're still going to mandate it, say, look, I'm going to look for other employment. And I've been one of your most productive employees. Is it really worth it? What about an accommodation? What about remote work? What about a COVID test? What about seeing if I've already have the antibodies from a prior COVID infection? And by the way, there's these risks of lawsuits that are coming if you do go that route. So, so far, just threatening that by employees has led employers haven't looked at this at all. A lot of their legal counsel are giving them terrible advice. So all of a sudden, as soon as any employee pushes back, they're like, well, let's have real broad religious exemptions. And in this context, there can be a lot of reasons for religious exemptions because of how this particular vaccine was made and what cells were used from different things has led people to have a strong religious objection. Some people have religious objections due to the idea of informed consent not being present because, the sanctity of the body. There's a lot of religions that have that component. So there's a lot of robust religious exemptions. Often people just pushing back. The employer or the government says, oh, hold on a second. Maybe we'll moderate this. Maybe we'll limit this. Maybe we'll push. So they're going to keep testing until they get pushback and then fighting in the courts of law where it's a useful thing for people to do. So, bringing lawsuits where they're appropriate anywhere and everywhere, whether it's an FDA lawsuit, whether it's using the Freedom of Information Act to get information, whether it's filing a ADA claim or First or Fourth or Fifth or Sixth Amendment claim, all of which could be implicated at different levels because of the kind of, or Ninth Amendment, In my view, that to the degree they're trying to allow battery to occur, that state battery without protection, that's really a Ninth Amendment violation, because the Ninth Amendment guaranteed all citizens everything that was previously a right could stay a right, and the government couldn't take it away. It's what people forget about the Ninth Amendment, but that's why it's there. And so there's a lot of ways to fight back. And I know, my firm is going to be heavily involved in trying to do everything we can, talk to other people. But I think people underestimate their own power. One of my favorite sayings is, greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing people he did not exist. The greatest trick the system ever pulled is convincing people they cannot resist. And if they just remember they're really the fifth pillar of power that holds up the other four pillars of power, they often can change things even when the odds look impossible.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Well, let's leave it on that note, because these are crazy, unprecedented times, although we have seen little bits and pieces throughout history. But this is insane what we're dealing with right now. That's the bottom line. But it's good to know that we do have some sort of way to push back. And I remember one of my main takeaways that gave me a lot of comfort a few months ago when I was reading Road to Serfdom. I was listening to the audio book, and I had a version of it where Hayek did some commentary after the fact, like 5-10 years later after he actually wrote the book. And he said that a lot of people came up to him thinking that once you get on the road to serfdom, that you're doomed as a society, that it only leads to totalitarianism. And he said that's actually not true. And he pointed that out several times. So I think that we are definitely on the road to serfdom right now. I think that's blatantly obvious. But the good news is we can get off the road. We just have to realize that we have the power to do so.
Absolutely. The only way the world ever changed was somebody trying to make it change.
Yeah. All right, buddy. For my viewers and listeners who want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
Yeah, so I have some examples of letters other employees have used to deal with the vaccine mandates.
Oh, cool.
All of that is at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. So vivabarneslaw.locals.com. It's pinned to the top of the board. You can see the examples. I assert no copyright. It's not legal advice. It's a letter that came to me in a bottle here in Vegas. And you're free to copy and replicate it and use it however you want. A bunch of people have, and a good number of them have had good success just by doing that. So it's just all the different ways we can fight back and push back to restore and retain our core liberties is critical. And it's one way everybody can.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, man, I'll let you go. We've kept you an hour and a half. Let's do it again in 6 weeks, 8 weeks. We'll do another update on the FOIA, and then try to take an inventory of what's going on with freedom, liberty, and go from there.
Sounds good.
Hi, guys. I'd like to invite each and every one of you to the next Rebel Capitalist Live event. If you are a fan of the Rebel Capitalist show, I guarantee you will love the live event. The next one is Houston, where you can meet and listen to speakers, all your favorites from the Rebel Capitalist show. People such as Dr. Ron Paul, Chris Cole, Lynn Alden, Luke Gromen, just to name a few. If you want to check out the rest of the speaker list and find out how you can attend, we'll put a link in the description below, or you can just go to rebelcapitalistlive.com. This is an event where you can learn to build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. But it's not just about building wealth. It's about increasing your freedom and networking with like-minded individuals, fellow rebel capitalists. It's an amazing event. I know you'll absolutely love it. Check out rebelcapitalistlive.com, and I will see you in Houston.